Welcome to the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. If your job involves working with or influencing people's behavior, this podcast offers invaluable insights into what makes people tick. Through personal interviews that are thoughtful and surprising, we explore the full range of the roots to people smarts that can help you make or break your own career. My name is Marie Gervais, and with a PhD in culture and learning in the workplace and my own cultural journey, I bring the mysteries of human beings at work around the world to you. Through conversations with very diverse people, examining the groups they were born into and the ones they chose to belong to, my podcast takes a deep dive into why people do what they do and how they belong. Hone your skills to manage others and to be a better human being at work with the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. And now for today's episode. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners. Today, I have the distinct honor to present to you Peter Cappelli, who is the George W. Taylor Professor of Management at the Wharton School and Director of Wharton's Center for Human Resources. He is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, served as senior advisor to the Kingdom of Bahrain for employment policy for a few years, was a distinguished scholar of the Ministry of Manpower for Singapore and co-director of the U.S., and is considered by HR Magazine as one of the top 5 most influential management thinkers and by NPR as one of the 50 influencers in the field of aging. His credentials just go on. He was elected a fellow of the National Academy of Human Resources and has received numerous awards, the regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal, and writes a monthly column for HR Executive Magazine. He recently wrote about performance management, agile systems, and hiring practices, in addition to other workplace topics which appear in the Harvard Business Review. This is a perfect fit for our podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Peter.
Thank you.
I'm so honored that you could spend some time talking. So tell the audience a little bit about who you are personally. You don't have to repeat anything from the bio, but the things that are not in the bio would be great.
I was born in upstate New York. My father was born in Italy. My mother was born in Alabama. This won't surprise people from a certain generation that they met in the Second World War. My mother was, ended up almost, as a captain. And my father was a private, and they weren't supposed to fraternize. And of course, they did fraternize, and here I am as a result of that. But it was a little bit of a scandal, I suppose, at the time. And they separated and went their separate ways, and for several years. And then I think my grandmother apparently wanted my father to get back together with my mother, and she kind of engineered it. And the story I got is my aunt called my mother on a Thanksgiving, so it's like 1950 or something, and just told my aunt, there's somebody here who wants to talk to you. And then they called my father into the room and said, there's somebody here who wants to talk to you, and just handed him the phone, and then poof, there they were. So it's obviously more happened than that, but here I am as a result of that.
Well, that's a great story. It reminds me of a similar story that I just found out about a few years ago. My father has very severe Alzheimer's right now, but when he was still okay and in his 80s, he received a phone call from the woman he met on the ship coming over from Germany. And apparently they had some kind of torrid romance and they remembered each other. They both got married, had children, were widowed, and then afterwards met each other again through a grandchild who introduced them to their old flame. So yeah, interesting how things keep coming back, right? You start with something and then it comes back to you even many years later.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your childhood. What stands out? A couple of incidents that, really marked you and helped you to be the person that you are today.
There's this long literature and continuing debate about nurture and nature, right, in terms of what defines us. And I think the nature thing has been pushing back in recent years. And I think there are two things that I remember. One is that I used to follow my mother around when I was 2 or 3 and constantly pepper her with counterfactual questions. Well, what if this happened? She would give me an answer to something, and then I said, well, what if this? And then what if this? And what if that? I'm sure I drove her nuts on that, but that idea of kind of contingency thinking and counterfactuals, persists. I think the other thing, which is kind of fundamental, is I have a pretty big case of attention deficit disorder. I mean, clinically, attention deficit disorder, not just a short attention span. But that plays itself out in interesting ways. I think one of the ways is that it's quite often the case people with this have two or three things going on at the same time in their heads, and sometimes can see connections between things that are perhaps not so obvious or other people have not seen. So I'd say in lots of my work tends to be somewhat between different fields and sometimes applying principles and concepts from one field to another. And maybe that is related to this disposition or shadow psychiatric disorder, depending on how you want to think about it.
Mm. You were diagnosed with this early on, or did you know later that you had attention deficit disorder?
Oh, like most parents, you learn this through what you think your children have. And I don't think actually it turned out neither of my kids did, but you start thinking about what it is, and then there are these tests, and then you can look at the symptoms and you say, "Ooh,
that sounds like me.
This is me." And so, not too much of a surprise that we learn ourselves in part by worrying about our own kids, right?
That is true. That's so true. So can you think of a time when you were a child when this attention deficit, you maybe didn't know what it was called, but it caused you some kind of an issue or helped you to leap forward in some way?
Well, mainly issues, right? I mean, I couldn't sit still in school and we're constantly in trouble for that. And, doing things that required multiple steps and paying attention to each step. I'm still lousy at that. I can't manage calendars very well. I remember in high school chemistry class, remember we probably had to do everyone these titration things where you're producing this mix of something and then you're going to put it on a spectrometer and see what it looked like. And mine came out a different color than everybody else's. It wasn't even close to the right thing. So it was a problem.
You maybe invented some entirely new reaction.
And I failed that exercise too, So it was not a plus, let's put it that way. And in college, it was extremely difficult. This is before there were diagnoses really for this thing, and before certainly there were treatments for it. And I did not encounter until later in life even coffee, which is, as George Carlin would say, the low end of the speed spectrum, And so I basically just locked myself away in dark libraries and stuff and took away all distractions, and it was not fun. I can't say that this was a magical experience. It was a problem.
But you found a way to manage it.
Well, found a way to manage it. You pay a price for that, right? You're awfully hard on yourself and you're not doing other things you could have been doing because it takes you maybe longer to do some of these things than it might take other people because you're easily distracted, right?
Well, you might have developed some capacities out of that as well, like the ability to learn how to create an environment around you where you won't be distracted.
Yeah, possible.
And ways to get to a problem that would provide multiple lenses because your mind would jump around so you wouldn't stay in one place for a long time.
Possible. It's also possible it's dispositional. That is not anything I learned. It's something that, as with the counterfactuals talking to my mother when I was 3, what about this one? Well, what if this happened? Just maybe it was a way I was hardwired to think,
So what about as a young adult? Is there something that stands out for you?
I mean, I think my undergraduate experience spanned disciplines on similar topics. So thinking about workforce things, which is what I ended up studying, I had sociology classes on this and economics classes and psychology classes sort of on the same topic. And, that's not really useful for an academic career.
Really useful for industry bridging, though.
Yeah, it's useful for taking lessons from one and applying it to the other. But, the academic world wants you to pick a team, right? And it's not organized around topic, even though people think it is. It's not. There are almost anything to do with business or social life. There are people studying it from quite different perspectives, and they don't talk to each other, and they don't know about each other, and they're not interested in each other, right?
And that's why they come up with incorrect decisions, because they have incomplete data.
Yeah, and they're not interested necessarily in answering questions. They're interested in extending a paradigm. How far can we push our theoretical lens into a topic rather than can we actually explain what's going on, right? So that is a little different. I think I've been more interested in explaining what's going on and a little irritated at the extent to which colleagues are not interested in that or willing to kind of just ignore obvious stuff in order to extend paradigm.
It seems very narrow when you think about it and hearing you describe it.
Right. I think if you're not in the academic world, you think that that's what we're trying to do is explain stuff. And it's probably not true. We're trying to extend a paradigm.
Right. Right. So when you were growing up, you were born somewhere, a place, and then that place would have had a social class, would have had possibly a religious influence, would have had some, language influences. There's a national culture, there's regional, there's neighborhood culture. Like, what affected you, would you say? What are some of the stronger cultural influences from your childhood, from those groups that you didn't have any say over, you just happened to be there?
Well, my family grew up in my father's family, and they were first generation American Italians. And I can't say I learned to speak Italian, but they were always yelling at each other in Italian. I mean, not really yelling at each other, but loudly discussing things in Italian with each other. But I can't say it had an overwhelming influence. I think I was a product of the early 1960s baby boom experience, which was deep and pervasive. Growing up at a period where third grade class assignments, or fourth grade for most everybody, was to prepare a bomb shelter for your family in case of nuclear war, was, pretty common thing. We lived 10 miles from a strategic Air Force base. So we were told we were ground zero in a nuclear attack, and we had these duck and cover drills all the time. And the fight with the Soviet Union was first and foremost in your mind. And the President's Council on Physical Fitness was telling you it was important to do sit-ups because that was how we were helping to beat the Ruskies,
Yeah. So how do you think that shaped your sense of culture and leadership?
I think there was a sense, for good or for bad, of national unity and purpose. This is before the Vietnam War. And there were 3 television channels, so everybody was watching the same stuff. You went to elementary school and everybody the night before was watching Bonanza or Walt Disney's TV show. So everybody watched that stuff. And there was a sense that you were part of this national community, which I think you don't see that hardly at all anymore. And the same thing with music. There was a sense, I think, among people who were younger that when Motown was coming out and then when heavy rock music was coming out, that everybody was listening to this stuff. But that wasn't true either, because unless you happened to be in a big city, the radio stations weren't playing it. You couldn't hear Motown music in big parts of the country until mid-60s or so, right? And even hard rock, or album-oriented rock, as it became known at the time, is something that didn't appear on most radio stations until late 1960s, right? So some aspects of the 1960s didn't get there until the 70s, but everybody was listening to the same stuff, So you did have this sense of community that you were kind of all in this a little bit together, and you were in and out of each other's houses, and that was sort of pervasive. A very common experience, I think, that people of my age group and generation all had that wouldn't have been too different, probably across parts of the country. I don't think really. My wife grew up in rural Tennessee, and it wasn't wildly different, I wouldn't think, down there.
The way you're talking about music and television channels and whatnot, that's similar to what my husband would say about his childhood, where he basically felt like he was part of this whole and that everybody was doing the same thing. And I wouldn't say that's the same for everybody. It depends on who you were and what you were doing. And so in his situation, it's similar to what you were saying. So it gave him a sense that everything was good and that you could talk about the same things. And sometimes he'll be talking to a group of immigrants and say, oh, you probably remember from the 1970s that this particular star was popular and this was their favorite song. And I keep nudging them and going, yeah, they're listening to their own music at that time. There was no internet. What makes you think they would have been doing the same thing as you? So it really gives him a sense of feeling grounded and a sense of pride. And that sounds similar to what you're saying as well.
Yeah, I think there was also a state identity. I remember thinking that I lived in New York State and that, there was this kind of hierarchy in the country. And every 100 miles further south, things obviously got worse, that we were sort of on top of the national economy and culture and such, and wasn't really true. So there was some state level regional identity that came as well.
Interesting. Very interesting. So then you would have grew up and you chose to belong to, academic groups, workforce interests were some things, but there would have been other things that might have influenced you, and maybe you lived for a time in other places, because it sounds to me like you did, because if you had to do with the Kingdom of Bahrain and Singapore, you would have had some experiences with other cultures and languages other than American. So what did you adopt, or what did you become aware of?
Well, I went to graduate school. So at 21, I left the US and went to England. So I went to graduate school in Oxford, and that's a profound experience. I'd never been out of the country before, unless you count Canada, which in those days you didn't need a passport to go to Canada. So yeah, 21, my father had died and my family was kind of coming apart a little bit. And I moved to Oxford. And yeah, it's a pretty different experience.
What stands out?
It's a much more verbal place. You know, there
Mm-hmm.
are 25 ways to say good morning in England, and
Mm-hmm.
in Oxford, the wordplay was a big deal. And it was sort of, it's also, of course, very hierarchical society, or certainly was then, or appeared to be. I mean, the US, it turns out, in terms of mobility, is actually even less mobile than the United Kingdom. But certainly they had a class system and you were kind of on top of it. And the nice thing for Americans being there is that you were kind of on top of it, but you were not judged by it because, you're not English. You just happen to be sitting at Oxford, right? So that was a wonderful experience, extremely social, a lot of time spent in discourse and talking to each other, lots of different people coming together. Expectations were that you would spend time just talking. So, for example, every day, twice a day, there was a coffee break and everybody left their office and went downstairs to coffee, and you just happened to sit next to people. And when you went to lunch or dinner, there was a rule that you had to sit next to whoever was in line in front of you. You couldn't go peel off with your friends and go sit on some other table. You just had to sit next to whoever was in front of you. So you were mixed up with all these other people and ended up with this very rich and very broad tapestry of interactions with people. So that was, wonderful, really profoundly important experience.
That's a really great idea to have that kind of rule in an institution,
Yeah.
so people get to know people from different departments, and there would be a lot less siloing, I would think.
Well, you learn lots of things that you would never learn before about different fields and about different countries and things, So
And people's lives too.
yeah. Right.
And did you retain any of that? Did anything from your UK experience become part of you?
I'm sure it did, but I think it also goes away. I mean, I was maybe a bit of a chameleon. I, developed an English accent, which I didn't even notice until I came to the US, But I went from Oxford to MIT, which is like going from alpha to omega. I mean, they're completely the opposite sort of institution. MIT was not a place where you would go for social skills.
No.
It was pretty nerdy and very practical, I suppose you might say. But also, you were expected to do things and produce things, and simply talking about stuff had zero value, right? So it was about as far removed as you could be. And I remember being able to step away from that a little bit and watch the Oxford culture being slowly eroded, quite conscious of it, And at first I just found MIT just amusing and puzzling. And then you quickly start to realize that you are becoming that person too. So that was quite an unusual experience. Those two institutions are about as far apart as you could imagine.
Well, to be aware of that and then to realize that this is a sort of transmutation process you're going through yourself is unusual. I think a lot of times people, they say, I don't like this. And then all of a sudden they wake up and they're just practicing things they didn't think they would before, but it doesn't hit them, When you said chameleon, I think it's more like conscious chameleon. You're conscious of it, right?
Right. You're aware of it. Yeah.
What about Bahrain and Singapore?
Well, I mean, they sound better on paper than they probably were. I didn't spend all that much time in Bahrain. I spent a fair amount of time in Singapore. So I was there every year in Singapore. But, there is something common about just learning to be a foreigner, which is just being able to watch a little bit and to not judge, or at least not judge out loud or not look like you're judging.
Or to suspend judgment until you have more information.
Yeah, I would hope that's what I was doing rather than just keeping your mouth shut. But I think I was probably more just keeping my mouth shut. But, I spent a fair amount of time going to other countries to do things, partly because other people didn't always want to do it. I'm not sure exactly why, but I always thought it was kind of interesting. Maybe it was attention deficit.
You're open to being uncomfortable. When people are not open to being uncomfortable, then they tend to shy away from those kinds of experiences. But if you're open to it, then, it'll be uncomfortable, but hey, let's see what I can learn, or it might be interesting, or keep my attention longer than it might if I stay where I am. So
yeah, that's certainly true, right? So I did a fair bit of that. I was in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev had just come in, and that was quite an interesting experience. I was part of an American delegation that was there for a few weeks. And I remember we were in the city of Kharkov, which is now in Ukraine, the scene of horrific battles, right? And we spent, I don't know, a week there or so. And one day you'd meet these officials and there would be translators. And the translators had never met native English speakers before. And so the next day you had a different meeting with a different group, but the translators from the previous day would show up just to follow you around and listen to you. So after about 4 or 5 days, when we would leave our hotel, there would be a crowd of people just following us around, listening to us talk, which was a pretty wild experience. And you could start to think you must be something special. You're not anything really special, except that you were unusual in that context, So, I mean, Soviet Union was interesting because it was the strangest place that you could go at that point in the world, right? I mean, everything fundamentally was different. And that wasn't always true, at least to the places that you were likely to travel, which were urban places in the rest of the world, which had a similarity to them, right?
A number of years ago, one of our daughters did a year of youth service in the Czech Republic. And we went at the end of her year to see a little bit about what she'd seen and then come back with her. And when we were there, we went to the Museum of Communism. And after having been there for a week and a half and being really perplexed by the behaviors and the attitudes and what I saw around me, because I have been to many countries, but no communist countries, right? So when we went into the Museum of Communism there, we saw the history of the Czech Republic and communism. So much stuff fell into place. I went, oh, I get it. That's why they do this. That's why this thing happens. Okay. It was like a whole flood of relief to understand something about what was going on because it felt so strange to me. I don't know if you felt that kind of strangeness when you were in the Soviet Union.
Well, for my business school colleagues, this particular story had resonance. We were touring a factory someplace in Russia. And this guy was explaining, who ran the factory, so things were just beginning to open up for something like a market. And he was explaining that he had this furniture that the factory made, and there was a lot of demand for it, but he couldn't meet the demand. And so he needed a foreign partner to help him get some money so they could expand their business. They needed more equipment to expand. They didn't have enough money to do it. And he was explaining this problem. And I said, why don't you just raise your prices? And the guy was literally, his face dropped. He was stunned. And about a minute later, he said, you are a genius.
Well, because of the mentality that there's a certain fixed rate and you just don't go beyond it.
Right. I mean, under communism, you had no control prices.
Yeah.
So this was just something that was not possible. And the idea that, profit at the end was something that you could control was a completely new idea for them, but it seems just patently obvious to us. But if you never thought about supply and demand, and if you lived in an economy where everything was done with giant input-output matrices rather than markets, that was a wild idea.
That's a really great story. I really like it. Let me ask you a little bit about your temperament and your personality. So temperament is being what you're born with, and people go, oh, yeah, that's the way he was when he was just a little tyke. Peter did that then, and he's now still asking what ifs. And then personality, as you add on what you learn and obstacles you overcome or don't overcome, how that forms you. So what would you say you were born with? Don't talk about nature nurture, something that's just been pervasive. And then things you've added on through experience of life.
Well, I think I am quite argumentative, which I suppose is the same sort of thing as counterfactual as a little kid, just questioning all the time. And I think argumentative is another way of saying if something doesn't sound right, do you question it or you just ignore it, right? And so my inclination is to question it, which irritates lots of people. Most people, everybody in authority, tends not to be particularly keen on questions, right? So I'd say that is pervasive. I think earlier in my career, when I was younger, I sort of maybe toned that down a little bit, just tried not to be very argumentative. And I think at this point I figure, well, why not?
What the heck? I'm old enough.
Why not just ask the question? And if they're not particularly happy about it, that's still kind of important. I think, it sounds pedantic to say that you're interested in truth because it sounds sort of so obvious. But, the question is compared to what? Are you interested in trying to get at the truth of something at the cost of irritating other people? And I would say, yeah, I am. And so you say everybody's interested in truth.
No, not true.
Yeah. A lot of people want to get along. And That is kind of an attribute of academics, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And whether I had it already, maybe I did, but academics kind of have that attribute. That's kind of accepted more. I would say it's less and less, though, to be honest.
Yeah, because the investigation into what is true and what is real has
Yeah.
become so much tempered by people's agendas and egos and political
I think
affiliations.
that's true, right?
But still, if you're looking to find what is really happening here, if you're interested in workplace, which you are, then you will want to know what's really happening here. You're going to keep asking good questions until you get to what's really going on. And it can be so exciting when people even collaboratively go, wow, that is what's going on. And we never knew. Now we've got it, right? Now we've got a handle on it. Now we know what we could do next, right?
I hope that's right. But, the paradigms in science resist certain questions as well.
They do, yeah.
That's not what we do, would be a very common kind of approach, right? And
then you base your identity around some particular method or some approach, and then you miss out on your opportunity to find out what's true and real.
And different fields have different views as to what's kind of out of bounds. I think in the social sciences, the sociologists are the most open, I think. I would have said a generation ago that the economists were the least open, but the economics paradigm has actually weakened quite a bit. And applied economics these days is really remarkably wide open. Tell me an interesting fact is the defining attribute of applied economics these days. So psychology is the field that is the most closed, I would say right now, in terms of arguments that have to be internally consistent and they have to fit with what we've done already and changed, I think, quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. So a time when you experienced cognitive dissonance, culture shock, and you did mention several of them already. You mentioned the UK, you mentioned the Soviet Union, and I'm sure you've had many, but can you think of another one where it just hit you? This is not the norm, and I never knew. Thinking about a writer named Léonard Laroche, who wrote about how he's from France, and in France you always eat dinner at about 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And he thought that's what everybody did. And when he traveled around the world, he realized that some people don't eat dinner at all. They cook stuff at the beginning and people in the family go and eat when they're hungry. And there is no dinner time, and others we eat at different times, and their practice of dinner was quite different. And at first he was pretty much in a huff about it. Then he realized, that's a norm that I have, and I didn't realize it. So I don't know if that gives you any ideas. It's a pretty simple one, but often those simple ones can be quite insightful.
Yeah, I think the one that I continue to run in, if you think about my work and thinking about the workplace and such, there are entire industries, public affairs, public relations, that are designed to present particular images of things, which are often not even true, right? Like, to give you an example, the topic of generational differences. There's an entire industry around telling people about those differences and how you should manage them, etc. Well, the demographers will tell you that none of that's true. There's no evidence for any of that. There's things that sound credible until you look at them carefully, and it's really just mistakes in attribution people are making. They're looking at age differences. Younger people act differently. And they're saying, aha, it's because of a new generation. It's not a new generation. It's just the way younger people act.
It's just developmental.
When you're older, you forget how younger people often act and that you were thinking the same way, but nobody wants to think that. One of our friends was complaining about the hairstyles of his son. And my wife pointed out that, when he was a kid, that parents were complaining about his hairstyles as well, right? So I think running into that is quite an issue when you discover that there are public relations, public businesses and companies that are arguing for positions which are simply not right. They're spinning stories about what organizations are doing and leaders are doing, which are misleading at best. And so running into that, people who are not interested in the truth is always a bit shocking. The downside of that is it's easy to make you cynical about things. And I can't say that I have resisted that particularly well. And I would say if there's a concern, the concern is as a parent, you don't want to pass on cynicism to your kids. For sure, I passed on sarcasm to my kids. They had a master class in sarcasm growing up, and that's not something I would have wished for, but you can't pick everything that you pass along. That's the downside, I would think.
I think what I was thinking of is really when you have a moment of cultural surprise or cultural shock or cognitive dissonance, you don't see it as being an irritant with people who don't see things outside of their own narrow view. It's more like you have a heart experience. It's like, oh, wow, I totally missed that. Mm-hmm. It's an insight feeling.
Yeah, maybe I was just more open-minded when you look at people from different cultures in society. I can't say I'm wildly surprised that, to find that people thought this or thought that.
Well, maybe you just haven't moved across social class. Social class is quite the cognitive disruptor.
Yeah, it could be.
How comfortable are you speaking with someone who's homeless and living on the street?
Yeah, well, that's true.
Yeah.
There are some which are big. I guess I see the ones which I find big are the ones when you're dealing with people from the same class, from the same background, who are advocating positions and making arguments which don't seem to be true. I find that much harder to deal with than the fact that somebody from a different background thinks about the world differently.
Well, that's harder to deal with because of our desire to be right rather than understand.
Yeah, about the value evidence and things, right?
Yeah, and it is hard to see the other person's point of view when we disagree fundamentally with their position. However, finding a point of unity can be really useful. Well,
and I think there's also, this is a deeper question in philosophy about relativism, right? And I'm not a big fan of relativism. I don't think everything is subjective. I don't think.
Or absolute, really. Things are not absolute and they're not subjective. There is a healthy balance, an organic balance that we haven't discovered yet as a human race.
Well, a longer conversation about that, but there are serious thinkers who do believe that they're absolutes.
Yeah, but we may never get there. So truth may be an absolute, but I have to keep trying to get there, and so do other people, because just when we get to that point where we think we've got it, then something new comes up and you go, looks like truth is bigger than we thought. Well, I think there are some things that we might find that most everybody agrees on that we would think are true about moral questions, for example. I hope so, because we certainly need it. Mm-hmm. Well, what brings out the best in you? So if you're working with other people on a contract basis or as an academic, what kind of an environment is really conducive to you being at your best? I would say novel questions where there's a lot of rich information, So I wouldn't say it's a blank sheet of paper. I don't think I do particularly well with that. But, here's a complicated issue with a lot of evidence bouncing around about it, and with people who want something similar on that works well for me, I would say, as opposed to, I don't think I necessarily would work well in a courtroom-like setting, where you have people who are taking positions for the sake of taking positions and fighting them out to hope that truth comes out in the middle of that. I don't think that would work particularly well for me. Mm-hmm. And I think being with people who have relatively similar experience base saves time. So that's probably helps me as well, I would think. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So here's your soapbox moment. What would you like to promote? Promote in terms of world peace, sort of promote? Whatever you like. If you wish to promote world peace, I'm on that bandwagon as well. If you want to promote some product or book or course or thought, I'm very happy to hear about it as well. Okay. Well, I have written a book which is just coming out now, which I think is trying to answer one of these bigger questions. And the bigger question is, why is it that we see the way people get managed in organizations, but particularly in businesses, get managed in ways which just don't seem to make any sense? Like, why is it that companies lay off people knowing that they probably will have to go hire other people to replace them pretty soon? Why is it that we don't spend money training people, even when we know that they end up performing better afterwards? Why is it that we resist managing them well, even knowing that they perform much better when we do? So what I wrote about is how the context for some people in business, but particularly finance people, is just so fundamentally different. They're playing a different game. So financial accounting in particular, which sets the rules for investors, which drives the behavior of companies, is just really incomplete in lots of ways that create these problems. So, for example, financial accounting requires that anything that be an asset that has value has to be something that you own. So if you don't own it, it can't be an asset. It can't have value. So in financial accounting, if you looked at a professional sports team, for example, and all the players who were there and even all the contracts you have for them, financial accounting says, sorry, no value there because you don't own those people. So there can't be any value. So if you think about laying off people, it says, well, it doesn't cost anything because you didn't own them anyway. So you're not losing anything, right? So what's the name of this book that you wrote?
The book is called Our Least Important Assets, and it's coming out sort of as we speak.
So you're going to be focusing on unveiling what this financial focus brings in terms of making bad management decisions. But then what are you going to propose as a solution?
I think what I was saying in this book is explaining why is it that people take such alternative views which don't seem to make economic sense or business sense. And the explanation is that they, make financial sense according to financial accounting, which is the game that they're playing.
Yeah.
And so the answer to get better on financial accounting, which is not unique to me, other people are making the same argument, is that we need to change reporting systems so that, for example, investors are complaining about this as well because they feel they can't really get a sense of what human capital companies are really worth or whether they're doing well or not because they can't see whether you have human assets. They can't see whether you're spending money on training or whether it's carpeting or something else. They can't differentiate those. So, I think more information is the reasonably simple answer to that. It's not a hard problem to solve, except it does require getting the accounting industry to change behavior, which has been an extremely difficult thing to do.
Or getting more players in other than just the main player being the accounting industry.
Well, the problem there is that the financial industry is the dog that is wagging the tail of everything else. So unless you change the power structure of, American business in particular, that's not going to work. But you could change the way that structure operates if you could insert more information into it. Then you wouldn't have quite such obvious imperfections going on, which is what we're putting right now.
I think it's a good hypothesis, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out face-to-face with human nature and people's beliefs and fears and attachments. But yeah, it'll be really interesting to read that and see what that's all about. I hope you can send me the name of the book so that we can put that into the show notes as well.
We certainly will.
Yeah. So is there anything else you'd like to say before we end the interview?
I was going to say, don't wait for the movie version to come out because it's I'm not going to, but the book is out. There you go.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. I really do appreciate your time and your thoughts and sharing this little segment of your life with the podcast listeners.
Good. My pleasure.
Have yourself an awesome rest of the day. Peter Cappelli started out in life as a relentless what-if questioner, which has carried him through to his interactions, research, and writing in the field of why workplaces do the things they do. His experiences living and studying in the UK at Oxford and then in the USA at MIT University caused him to notice differences both outside and inside himself as he blended into each context. This ability to see things from multiple points of view while continuing to seek a more profound truth has been a characteristic throughout his adult life and colors his approach to leadership and management. He has been featured in HBR's 10 must-reads for reinventing HR and performance management, and has written extensively on a variety of workplace topics such as why good people can't get jobs, managing the older worker, the future of the office, and change at work. As one of the most important workplace thinkers of our time, I recommend reading some of his work and experiencing the breadth and depth of his insights. I enjoyed Peter Cappelli's stories about his life and how they shaped him, and applaud his ability to work past the restrictions of ADHD long before it was diagnosable. As always, please share this episode with a friend and rate and review our podcast to help spread the influence of thoughtful voices and multiple perspectives about work, leadership, learning, and culture. Thank you so much for listening, and may culture and leadership connections continue to guide and inspire your day. Want to show some appreciation? You can buy me a coffee. What? How do you buy a coffee for a podcast owner? Well, there's a way. Let me explain. You go to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. That's spelled MARIEGERVAIS. So it's buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. And when you go to that website, what's going to happen is you'll get a chance to click on 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 cups of coffee at $5 a piece to help contribute to the cost of the podcast. And yes, it's $5 for a cup of coffee because it's quality coffee for a quality podcast. So I hope you will contribute and you'll help us to reduce the costs of the podcast by going to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. Thank you in advance for your generous contribution.